Hello, hi Andy. Thank you so much. So I'm also very pleased to that Andy is here to talk to us. Andy is I would say a fun guy. I got to know Andy from my time as a postdoc at Princeton. Andy was at that point still a young, enthusiastic PhD student. Now Andy is a research scientist at Google AI working on vision for robotics. His research focuses on the manipulation of self-supervised deep learning, and he wants to enable machines to intelligently interact with the physical world and improve themselves over time. And his work has been featured in various news sites and has also been recognized with various best paper system awards as well as being best paper finalists. So we can take it away now, Andy.
Cool. Thanks for the introduction, Angel, and thanks, Howard, for the great talk. So, hey, everybody, I'm Andy, and I work at Google. I'm excited to be here today to talk about reasoning from shapes to actions for robotics. So, our physical world is defined in 3D, and if our goal is to enable robots to navigate through and interact with objects in the physical world, I think it only makes sense for them to be perceiving the environment and to be reasoning about it in its full three-dimensional glory. So one case for why 3D is great is that, as we know, 2D camera images only provide a partial projection of the world, and this naturally leads to ambiguity. So for example, this picture was taken by my coworker and is actually quite representative of a class of edge cases that we regularly encounter when we train end-to-end visual motor policies for learning robotic manipulation from a single color camera. And if a robot could only rely on one image on the left to figure out when it should drop this bottle into the cup, then it would fail pretty hard, unless it could pick up on the small subpixel details. So 2D can be pretty ambiguous, but then also a lot of things that are mathematically simple in 3D can often appear as complex, discontinuous phenomena in 2D, like occlusions. And there are mathematical analogies for this. For example, it's well known in approximation theory that there exists a discontinuous multimodal nonlinear functions that are hard to fit. A simple example, for example, is the sine function, which appears as a step function in red here. And the black squiggly line tries to approximate this step function using a Chebyshev interpolant of degree 20. But in order to perfectly model this step function, you need an infinite number of polynomial terms. But then if you just kind of pop up one dimension higher, it's actually possible to fully express this one-dimensional discontinuous step function as the minimum level set of a very simple 2D continuous polynomial function expressed here. So in other words, distributions that might appear to be complex in lower dimensional data can turn out to be explained by much simpler linear processes when lifted into higher dimensions. And so things like occlusions may be more difficult to train models to learn to handle from 2D images, but may be much easier from 3D data simply because it matches the dimensionality of the data source, which is our physical world. So 3D is great because in many cases, it often simplifies the perception modeling problem from data. And it's also fantastic that 3D data is becoming more ubiquitous these days thanks to commodity depth sensors, LiDAR scanners, and even the latest iPhone. And even without explicit 3D data, I think that just having the 3D structure of the world implicitly encoded inside the model, like what these incredible NERF models are doing, is also an excellent means of recovering 3D representations, but now in the form of model parameters as opposed to point clouds. So either way, explicit or implicit, I'm excited by these developments, and I think that incorporating more and more 3D into our learning algorithms is the way to go. So today I wanted to offer a perspective on 3D vision for robotics that drives a lot of my own research. In the 1950s, psychologist James J. Gibson came up with a theory on perception in an effort to find an answer to the question, how do we see the world the way we do? And in his book, The Perception of the Visual World, he conjectures that perception is a compilation of the person's environment and how the person interacts with it. And there he coined the term affordance, which refers to the opportunities for action provided by a particular object or environment. So for example, when we look at stairs, what we see is that it affords us the ability to walk up a steep slope. And when we see objects in the environment, they might afford different behaviors such as pushing, lifting, or grasping. And this perception system is built over time as we grow older with experience by interacting with more objects and watching others interact as well. And I think that this is also just generally applicable to any sort of behavior in addition to manipulation or locomotion. So in other words, Gibson argued that when we perceive an object or parts of the object, what we really observe are the set of actions that we can perform with it and not its particular qualities. So for example, we might be able to grasp the handle of this tea kettle, but it might not be able to grasp it from the side. Or depending on our end effector, we might not want to touch it either from the side if it's hot to avoid damage. And I think that this diagram should start to look familiar to many of you now. One natural algorithmic instantiation of affordances is doing local shape classification or semantic 3D segmentation, where the class categories are the different actions that the robot could execute with motion primitives. And so I think this formulation extends to a wide range of settings, using many of the tools that the 3D vision community has developed over the recent years. For example, during a robotics competition, the Amazon Picking Challenge, we took a bunch of objects and tried to match what each type of robotic end effector could pick up and what they could not. We tested a suction cup, which is commonly used in industry these days, as well as a two-finger gripper. And the interesting thing to us was that there was a clear difference in the type of geometries that one end effector typically preferred over the other. So for example, suction worked really well for flat surfaces like tissue boxes or plastic cups, while grasping worked really well for bumpy, deformable, or porous surfaces like towels or sponges. And then some objects work well with either, depending on its pose. So for example, books, they kind of need suction if it's laying flat, and you need grasping if it's leaning against the side of a wall. And both end effectors were highly complementary in the things that they could pick up. So we ended up making our final end effector for the competition to be able to switch between the two modes. And we then took a bunch of objects in the lab and captured RGBD images with a real sense and manually labeled for every object in the point cloud all the surfaces where we thought suction would be best to pick it up and where two-finger grasping would be best. And we were essentially collecting data to train a shape classifier, which we used fully convolutional networks on both the color and depth channels to give us dense predictions of suction or grasping affordances. And by formulating it this way, the classifier ends up using these local shape features from the depth channels, giving it the capacity to potentially generalize to new objects that it hasn't seen before. So during the competition, we were the only team that stubbornly did not train on the new objects, even though we were provided 30 minutes to do so. But we still took first during the stow task and the challenge. So one cool part about turning the manipulation problem into a shape classification is that you can now do the same thing for other motion primitives. So for example, in TossingBot, we trained the models to not only predict the dense grasping confidence scores, but also to densely predict tossing velocities. And the idea there being that the shape of an object could also inform how to throw it. So for example, if you grasped a screwdriver by the handle near the center of mass and throw it, it would land much closer than if you had grasped it from the metal tip, which would cause it to swing forward and land much farther given the same velocity. So based on the shape of the object and where the grasp is located on the object, the model will have to predict a different velocity to compensate in order to achieve accurate throws. Another interesting part of this setup is that after picking up an object, it might not actually throw well, because if the grasp is not stable in the first place, then the variance of the object's dynamics would not be as predictable, making it less likely to land at where you were aiming. So in simulation, we did several controlled experiments where we were given a T-shaped object, and we would visualize the distribution of grasps learned from trial and error, self-supervised by whether or not it had lifted up the object. And the blue spots that you see here represent the spatial distribution of grasps predicted by the deep network. And the green dot is the center of mass. And when we compared that result to a grasping network that was actually supervised by throwing accuracy, so a grasp is only successful if the throw with that grasp accurately landed in the target box. This actually leads to a distribution of grasps that shift towards areas on the object that are more stable and less likely to slip out or overshoot during the throwing motion. So this kind of gets at the idea where we can leverage our 3D vision algorithms to map from perception to action. But then also, when we're working with real robots, we can actually use actions as a way to better inform the perception in a positive feedback loop. And in this particular instance, we were using throwing as a means to improve how we see grasps. And a really cool side effect from this is that we realized this form of supervision from action could actually lead to some very interesting deep features being learned. Since our network is fully convolutional, we can take the dense mid-level features and cluster them. And this heat map shows the attention map that visualizes a cluster of nearest neighbor pixels with neurons that are firing for what we believe semantically belong to the category of ping pong ball. And we didn't train with any object classification losses, so it was surprising to see that this object category naturally emerges as a byproduct from training these affordance models. And it was likely that the network recognized that this particular object with this particular shape needed special throwing velocities to compensate for air resistance. And likewise, we also found really cool feature clusters around all the marker pens in the scene again, without any sort of explicit object classification losses. And I think this actually ties into a kind of deeper vision question, which is that maybe the semantic categories are defined by our interactions in the physical world. So what makes a sofa is that we can sit on it and watch TV, or what makes a kitchen is the fact that we can cook something in the stove. And perhaps that's how our robots should learn the semantics of the world, as opposed to trying to classify everything into these rigidly human-defined class categories. Anyways, food for thought. Here are just a few more cool videos of tossing bot. This video is what it looks like when we're training it from trial and error. And throwing accuracy is automatically labeled with an overhead camera that uses image differencing to locate the thrown objects. And that's how it resets itself overnight. One thing that we learned from this project is that industrial grade hardware is getting incredibly good and very repeatable. So you could end up doing some pretty neat trick shots with tossing bot. And what's really preventing these machines, I think, from broadly doing awesome things in our unstructured physical world is that they're lacking the intelligence through machine learning. So I think that it's an exciting time to be working on research in vision for robotics. So one way to look at how we've been formulating the manipulation problem so far is that we're essentially learning to reason about the relationships between two geometries, the object and end effector. When we're grasping, our models might be learning whether the two shapes fit well together or not. And when we're tossing, our models might be predicting whether or not the contact dynamics would result in stable throws. So if we push this idea even further, a natural extension of this is that we can train models to reason about the shape-driven relationships, not only between objects to end effectors, but also between objects to other objects, and mapping those relationships to behaviors. For example, can this object fit inside of this box? Or can we position the plug such that it inserts it into the socket? Or can we assemble two pieces of furniture? The spatial structure of many manipulation tasks at its core is really reasoning about how to rearrange the objects against each other. So a more general formulation of this is kind of thinking about objects as chunks of 3D space. And what we're really after in manipulation, at least the perception problem, is figuring out how do we rearrange 3D space. And if we take a step back, I think a lot of the representations that we use in 3D vision today, including 6-dot poses or key points or descriptors, are all essentially trying to do the same thing, which is to help us decode the desired 3D displacements of objects, which we can then feed into downstream motion planners for robot control. And the challenge with these sorts of representations is that they require prior knowledge about the objects and impose some form of canonical coordinate frame to each object category. And this makes them rather difficult to scale to general purpose manipulation in the wild. So the question is, can we directly infer these displacements without relying on such object-centric representations? And this leads to the final project that I'll talk about today, transporter nets. And the overarching idea is that in order to figure out how an object or a chunk of 3D space should move and fit together with another, you take its 3D representation, which could be point clouds or a crop of voxels or 3D features, and overlay it in the scene in different ways, and train a deep network to return a fitness score, which can then be supervised with contrastive losses from demonstrations. And you can think of this as essentially a brute force search for how to best rearrange 3D space, except that you get an extra inductive bias with spatial structure from having the deep network see the overlaid 3D representations as input, rather than having to regress scalar values that represent a displacement. So here's a visualization of the pipeline where we first discretize the scene and then use an attention network to localize a region of interest. And then we crop that region out and use two other networks to compute dense features that we then do a sliding window search with cross convolution to find the best rearrangement of that 3D space. And then we feed the best displacement as parameters to downstream controllers to execute the action. And we applied this to learn how to rearrange objects for a variety of different robotic pick-and-place tasks. And because it uses these overlay 3D features, it naturally handles new object configurations and arbitrary symmetries. And because the network does not assume prior knowledge of any one set of objects, it can generalize to new objects depending on the diversity of the training data. And in these tabletop experiments, we focused on developing the 2D version of transporter nets since we wanted to mature and deploy something efficient and robust for industry use. But many of the project ideas here are all applicable to 3D as well. And of course, quantitative experiments to go with these types of studies to show that we're better than prior work. Okay, so to wrap it all up, today I talked about 3 ideas related to mapping from shapes to actions. And the first was affordance perception, how we could map from shapes to motion primitives, like grasping using today's tools in 3D vision. I then talked about how the effects of robot actions can be used to come back and improve our affordance perception models in a positive feedback loop. And the example that I gave was how downstream throwing accuracy could be used to better improve grasping affordances for tossing bot. I then went on a tangent on how the semantics of the world is perhaps best defined by our physical interactions as opposed to manually designed class categories. And finally, while the first two ideas largely discusses reasoning about the relationship between an object shape and the robot's end effector, I think that we could also have our models reason about the relationship between two object shapes and map that to actions. I showed how we were able to learn displacement affordances with transporter nets. There's also additional related work that I didn't get to talk about today, but shares and extends many of these ideas, like visual pre-training on computer vision data sets to better learn affordances, or learning target endpoints for multi-agent navigation, or extending displacement affordances to deformable objects. Feel free to browse the project links for more information. And with that, I'd like to thank all my collaborators, without whom a lot of this work would not have been possible. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Andy, for the nice talk. It's great to see so many interesting works that you've been doing. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask Andy. You can do so by either raising your hand or just typing your question directly in the chat. And please feel free to ask questions, because I think Andy has presented quite a variety. Okay, we have a question. How important is having a simulator matching the real world for learning? Do you tune your simulator to match the real world?
Yeah, at least in the role of simulation for a lot of the work that we've done, at least presented here so far, has been to find a good ranking of algorithms. So at least, for example, in TossingBot, we would have our training data come from simulation, we train on models that would be evaluated in simulation. And then on the real side, we would do the same, where the models would only use data from real and evaluate it in real. And at least for these projects, our emphasis was trying to figure out if we could learn from as little data as possible. And so at least in those regimes, it made sense for us to kind of take simulation, develop a bunch of algorithms, kind of rank which one was the most sample efficient, take the top one, and then put it on a real robot. So that was kind of the use case of simulation for us in those projects. We do try to tune some of the hyperparameters of the physics. So in TossingBot, we would like toy around with friction coefficients and try to inject some aerodynamic forces to make it feel a little bit more like a fluid simulator. But other than that, that's to the extent to which we tune the parameters there.
Thank you, Andy. There's a question from Brent. Please,
Hi.
please.
So I'm a big fan of TossingBot, and I'll say one thing that I was really impressed by was the residual physics, which you didn't get into today. But something else that you brought up today I thought was really interesting that I hadn't known about was how you talked about how there was this emergence of categories naturally when it was learning the joint affordance of throwing with like perception. I was just wondering, I'm really interested in this idea of robots continuing to learn with time, including learning about new objects they've never seen before in its environment. So can you talk about, if you have like any insights, how would it make the determination of, okay, does this belong to a category I've seen before versus when is it time to create a new category? Because there's a type of action or affordance with this object, like the ping pong ball. Like if it never seen it before, that it has to completely rethink the way that it would throw this kind of category. So just any discussion on that would be really interesting, and just thank you for the great talk.
Yeah, thanks for the good question. Yeah, that's a very interesting one. I think that at least what I think of how we as humans sort of acquire better sort of mapping from objects to behaviors, I feel like that's typically gotten through experience and specifically watching other people do things with those objects. And so, for example, if I was a 5-year-old and I saw my mother trying to avoid touching the side of the pot when it's cooking on the stove, I think that I would try to avoid it as much as possible as well if I were a good boy. But I think the interesting part to me, I think, is figuring out, yeah, exactly that. In this continual learning setting, how do we learn from our own interactions, but then also learn from other people's interactions as well? And how much information can we glean on what are the sets of actions we can execute on particular objects, and then apply that to the robot's sort of own self-continual learning system? So I think that's a great question, and I don't know what the answer is to it. I think that it's definitely a very interesting research problem to tackle.
Thank you, Andy. Marco has a question. What modifications would be needed to tossing bot to learn to place the object carefully inside of the box instead of throwing it? So I guess there's no longer tossing bot.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess there's 2 angles. Good question. So if we want to precisely place it, I think then we would do something closer to transporter nets, where we assume that our robots have a caging grasp, meaning that the degrees of freedom of the object are locked until we sort of release contact. If this is still kind of in the context of tossing bot, then I think that a key part to getting it to accurately land in a location is potentially having a catching robot as well. So specifically, I think there has been some work from probably work I'll send you the link afterwards, but they were capable of kind of using impedance controllers to sort of match the velocity of objects as they sort of get tracked over time, and then you can use that as a way to sort of reorient yourself in a way and then match the velocity such that the object sort of rests neatly on the destination. So that's specifically how you would do it if you still wanted the sort of aero transport style manipulation system. Yep.
Okay. So we have one last question. Sriram is interested in, is curious about how does the agent decide on what objects to rearrange first in the transporter network work? Yeah, for instance, in our blocking scenario.
Yeah, good question. So I realized I forgot to mention during the talk, but transporter nets is trained from demonstrations. So if we see demonstrators putting objects in a particular order, like the towers of Hanoi task, for example, then the model will try to replicate it as much as possible. And then depending on how much variation is in the demonstration, then that's how much generalization occurs. So if you were now doing placing of arbitrary objects into the cupboard or stocking it into a box, then they would try to generalize across that. And it would try to use the inductive biases from the overlay operation to try to get corners to match corners and edges to match edges while it's doing it.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Andy, for the great talk. We should move on to the poster, well, not the poster, but the paper presentations.